If we're really honest, when we look at how we spend our time, our energy, our resources, it's fair to say that we're constantly looking for happiness in countless ways and in countless moments throughout the day. And that's fine, there's nothing wrong with that. We have a right to experience happiness. But are we really getting the best use of our time and energy? Basically there are two ways that or two areas where we can look for happiness: in external causes, and this is really what we're doing most of the day, we're seeking the right partner, the right job, the right house, the right social media, personality, identity. We're chasing beautiful tastes and smells and experiences all day long. Again, nothing wrong with this, but we have to be really honest to see how these are not really satisfying, and that's difficult to admit. If we ask ourselves, are these things really necessary for our happiness? I think the pandemic has shown us that no, many of them aren't. And do any of these guarantee happiness? And again, I think we'd have to admit that no, they don't guarantee happiness when we have them. And so the Buddha showed that there's another avenue for pursuing happiness, and that's looking towards internal causes, particularly by cultivating positive states of mind, accurate states of mind that accord with reality. And an amazing quality about our mind is that these positive states can be developed further and further and further so that they become a lasting way of being, of thinking, of going through the world. We can actually develop compassion and love and kindness, wisdom, to the degree that they never wane. They're always there with us. So when we slow down to observe our mind and experiences, we see that happiness and satisfaction, deep inner peace, are a product of positive mind states that we can develop ourselves, while suffering and dissatisfaction are produced when our mind is disturbed and caught up in negative emotions like anger, resentment, shame, guilt, things like that. So when we really look into this situation, we begin to see how it is our mind, our own mind, is the creator of our happiness and suffering. And when we begin to trust this, then we can really make some changes that are worthwhile. Our life becomes so meaningful. And so we learn about such things when we study the topic of karma. And this afternoon we're going to explore a little bit about the 10 non-virtuous paths of actions, so that we can learn more about our minds and begin to, or continue to, transform our experiences. And we do this with an altruistic attitude, wishing to be of benefit, greater benefit to all beings. So just take a moment to cultivate that more extensive motivation in your mind. It was wonderful to see so many old friends and making new friends online during the discussion group today. So thank you for those very provocative, deep questions, Venerable Tarpa. Got us right into the thick of things. This morning, Venerable mentioned our incredible good fortune of having a precious human rebirth. And we have human intelligence, we have interest in the Dharma, we have contact with the Dharma and qualified teachers. And we have an opportunity right now to practice the Dharma. So how are we going to use this precious opportunity in the new year, this precious life? We so easily say, have a Happy New Year. We sign our emails, Happy New Year, but we have to create the causes for a Happy New Year. So how do we create causes for a Happy New Year? How do we avoid causes for suffering in the new year? If we truly want to create more happiness in our life, then the most urgent thing to understand is the law of cause and effect, and particularly the law of karma and its effects. That's a subset of the law of cause and effect. So we learn about this through thinking about the general characteristics of karma. I thought maybe Venerable would go through that this morning, but she didn't, so I'll just mention them briefly. We learn about the general characteristics of karma. More specifically, we look into a lot of the detail about the 10 non-virtues and learning how to refrain from them. Also looking at the 10 virtues so that we can see their opposites and know how to correct our behavior, how to modify our behavior so that we actually can bring about a more satisfying life. There are these 10 non-virtues that we're wanting to refrain from. There are also 10 virtues that are like the opposite of that. Just refraining from the 10 non-virtues is considered a virtue. But also we can look at the flip side of these and learn about the 10 virtues. So for instance, the first non-virtue is to refrain from killing. And that itself is a virtuous action when we intentionally, consciously, voluntarily begin to refrain from that. But then in addition to that, we learn about the 10 virtues where we can go the extra step and learn to proactively protect life. So for instance, when you come to visit the Abbey, you will find tick transport boxes in most of the rooms and bathrooms, where when we notice a tick in the springtime, we have lots of deer ticks. We, instead of squishing them, we put them in a little box and we take them outside. Okay, so there's corresponding non-virtues and virtues. And I know that there are a lot of new people who are hearing this presentation about karma and the 10 non-virtues, the 10 virtues for the first time. So just take it easy, take in whatever you can. There's a lot of detail. We don't have to go into every detail today. For those of you who are new, just let it wash over you. Take in what you can. If I use any jargon that you don't understand, just write a question in the chat box. What does that mean? It's kind of a habit to talk jargon in the Buddhist tradition, but we'll try to keep it on an understandable level. And also for those of you who've heard this many times, I find for myself it's a good review to read this section of the Lam Rim, the Graduated Path to Enlightenment, and to go through them. It recharges, it re-energizes my intention, my aspirations to catch the non-virtues more quickly, to apply antidotes to them more quickly. So basically we engage in actions in one of three ways: with our body, physically with our body, verbally with our speech, and then mentally with our mind. So all of these actions then can be traced back to an intention in our own mind. And so this is another way or another reason that we can say that the mind is the creator of our happiness and suffering. In Buddhism, the good news is that the mind is 100% responsible for all of our experiences. That means we can take control of what we're experiencing in our life. The bad news is we're 100% responsible. So it's a double-edged sword. Once we learn about karma and the law of cause and effect, then really we have to stop blaming other people for our experiences. So the Buddha summarized the 10 most obvious virtues and non-virtuous paths of actions. That's what we'll talk about today. Paths of actions that help and harm us. And all of the countless virtues and non-virtues can be subsumed within these 10. So of these 10 non-virtues, there are 3 physical non-virtues: killing, stealing, or taking what's not freely given, and unwise and unkind sexual misconduct. There are 4 verbal non-virtues: lying, which has come to be just a normal everyday event in the past 4 years. Lying, divisive speech, harsh words, and idle talk. So we'll look into these. And then there are 3 mental non-virtues that the Buddha identified for us to pay attention to: covetousness, maliciousness or ill will, and wrong views. So understanding karma is our key to creating whatever future results, present and future results, that we wish to experience. If we want to avoid suffering, here's how to do it. Begin by refraining from these 10 basic actions that are so easy to engage in. And if we want to create more happiness, then here's how to do it. Refrain from these 10 non-virtues. This is all within our ability to do in this lifetime, to become so habituated with refraining from these 10, and even engaging in their opposites, the 10 virtuous passive actions, so that we create the experiences that we like. It's interesting that we use the word dharma in a number of different ways, and one of the meanings of dharma is to hold, and specifically to hold back from suffering. So a lot of the teachings, maybe most of the teachings, maybe we could say all of the teachings that the Buddha gave, in some way hold us back or protect us from suffering. And so dharma is really like a science of mind. Cause and effect. What we see is there are causes that we create all day long, and there are effects to those causes. And so when we can connect the dots and understand that relationship, our lives are so much smoother. So whether we're Buddhist or not, whether we ever want to be a Buddhist or not, just studying a little bit about karma and the law of karma and its effects can really be beneficial for us. We begin to clean up our ethical behavior, not because we want to be Pollyanna or goody two-shoes, but because we see the science, we see the interdependence of our causes and the results that they bring. Or as Venerable puts it, we stop being a jerk. Because when we engage in these 10 non-virtues, we act like a jerk. So, particularly as Dharma practitioners too, those of you who do identify as Dharma practitioners, we want to know how to create the specific causes for good future rebirths. Sorry to burst your bubble, but most of us won't achieve enlightenment in this one lifetime. We're going to need a series of precious lifetimes, fortunate lifetimes, to continue progressing along the path. And so ethical conduct is the basis of a good rebirth. And, adding in the others, the 6 perfections, then we bring about a precious human rebirth, like many of us have right now. Usually we ask, why is this happening to me when something bad happens? But we can just as easily ask, why is this happening to me when something good happens to us? Like we live in a free country. I guess we can call America a free country. We live in a free country. We can go to the grocery store and buy whatever we need. We have access to education and, to some degree, healthcare. Various things that make our lives convenient and conducive to the kind of life we want. So learning to connect the dots of what is it that I actually want? What kind of life do I want? And what are the causes for that? That's something that we find here in this section on karma. Also, an ethical conduct is an essential foundation for creating personal liberation, becoming free of cyclic existence, and also for attaining enlightenment. So for some of us, this is very familiar, but for some people, this might be new, and it's important to make that connection about ethics being the foundation for us. So it's not enough just to say you have to be an ethical person. The Buddha said, here's a good place to get started with avoiding these 10 non-virtues. So it's important that we understand something about karma, what it is, what it isn't, and the reasoning and logic behind this universal law. So again, in this session, we'll look at these 10 karmic paths of actions, both non-virtues and virtues. So by understanding these 10 paths of actions, we can use our human intelligence to differentiate between constructive and destructive actions in our lives. Sometimes that's difficult. Sometimes it's not that obvious. And based on that, we can modify our behavior to avoid creating causes for our own suffering. We can also answer many of our own questions about actions in our lives. Like often people ask, isn't eating meat an act of killing? Well, we can look at the different factors or branches of a path of action, and we can begin to answer that question for ourselves. We'll look at that a little bit later. We can also help lead others to live more ethically as we become more ethical beings. For instance, one of the ways that we can be of greatest benefit to our family members, especially our parents, is to help them live a more ethical life if that's an issue for them. So first of all, we need to do it ourselves so that we can do it for them. And by learning about these 10 non-virtues and 10 virtues, then that really truly makes our lives very meaningful. So today I'm going to be relying on Volume 2 from the Library of Wisdom and Compassion that Venerable Chodron has been co-authoring with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. The second volume is called The Foundation of Buddhist Practice. And in fact, she's just recently given very explicit teachings on this very section within the second volume. So please look for those on the thuptenchodron.org website. You can scroll down under the series of teachings. Make sure you look under T for the foundation of Buddhist practice, not F for foundation, okay? Otherwise you won't find it. So as we go through these descriptions of the 10 paths of actions, it's important to keep in mind that karma is a natural law that functions whether we believe in it or not. Venerable often connects that or makes the connection with gravity. You know, whether we believe in gravity, whether we know about gravity, it still functions and it impacts us. And the same is true of karma. So it's helpful to look at it as a natural law. The Buddha didn't create the law of cause and effect. He just observed it through his awakened experience, and he described it to us out of real compassion for us, wanting us to have happiness that we're so much seeking. And also, it's good to keep in mind that the Buddha is not judging us according to our actions. He's not doling out punishment and rewards. But rather, it's like we've got this little camera sitting on our own shoulder, and it's our own mind that keeps track. It's like a speed camera, only it's for karma. So it goes with us wherever we are. Our own mind keeps track. And also it's good to keep in mind that when someone meets with misfortune, difficulties in their life, or maybe sickness, this doesn't mean that he or she deserves to suffer. That's so important to keep in mind. Sometimes people really confuse the idea of karma with deserving punishment. That's not how we understand it. It's not that we would say that a person made themselves sick by creating negative karma in a previous life. There's a connection for sure, but it's important that we understand this with compassion, and we bring compassion when we talk about karma. Okay, so the Buddha described these 10 paths of actions, and there are 4 parts, or 4 branches, we could say, to each of these paths of actions. Why are they called paths of actions? Because when all 4 of these branches are complete in an action, it creates a path to a new rebirth. If the actions are negative, it creates a path to an unfortunate type of rebirth, which we talk about in the Buddhist tradition. We won't go into that in great detail today. We'll save that for another talk. When we're involved in paths of actions that have to do with virtues, then we're creating the causes for good rebirths, like another human rebirth that we'll need when we have human intelligence and we have the interest and the opportunities to make real spiritual progress. So let's look at these 4 branches and try to understand them. And then we'll look at each of the non-virtues. We'll start with the non-virtues in relation to each of these 4. And by understanding these qualities or these aspects and keeping them in mind, then we can know how heavy or how powerful an imprint is that action leaves on our mind stream. So how it works is that when our mind is controlled by afflictions, begins with ignorance. Ignorance then gives rise to other afflictions. Exaggerating good qualities leads to attachment. Negative qualities, leads to aversion. And then when those disturbing emotions, destructive emotions are in our mind, we go about creating actions. And when those actions are complete, they leave a seed or an imprint on our mind stream. that sits there. It doesn't go to waste. It sits there until the causes and conditions come together or until we purify it, and then it gives rise to a result. If it's a negative seed, it gives rise to a negative result. If it's a positive seed, it gives rise to positive results. And particularly, we're talking about rebirths. So there's a basis of each action. That's the first branch. There's a basis. The person or the thing that's being acted upon. And then there's the attitude in our mind. And this has a couple of parts, 3 parts actually. So the attitude includes, first of all, correctly discriminating or recognizing the object. And this is interesting because we can intend, we'll get to this. Okay, correct discrimination. Then there's the motivation of wanting to do the action. And then there's also an affliction that's motivating the mind. So usually it's one of the 3. It's motivated by anger or attachment or ignorance or any of the secondary afflictions that stem off of those 3. Okay, so that's the attitude. Something's going on in our mind. We have a basis, we have an attitude, the mental aspect. And then there's the performance of the action, the actual performance, the actual deed, doing of the deed. And then there's something that brings that action to completion, such as being satisfied with the outcome, or sometimes there are very precise completions that we'll come upon. So if all 4 parts are present in an action, that becomes a path of action. Okay? And I thought it might be interesting that as we go through these 10 paths of actions, that we try to think of specific examples of each of these non-virtues that may have arisen in the past year due to the pandemic, or maybe the political landscape, or maybe in your own personal life. So let's try to be very, very specific. All right, so the first one is to refrain from killing. There's a path of action, the non-virtuous path of action of killing. So this is the first thing we're trying to refrain from. So what's the basis here? Well, the basis is another sentient being other than yourself who is alive. A sentient being is any being who has a mind. So this is excluding Buddhas, of course. We're talking about ordinary sentient beings. Then the attitude is discerning a living being as a living being, correctly identifying that person. So, for instance, with killing, someone may have a particular motivation to kill a particular person. Or a person could even have a correct discrimination by just intending to kill at large, in general. Like, for instance, one example that came to my mind is someone driving a car into a group of protesters, just intending to harm and to kill. If they had the intention to kill, then that discrimination would be correct. So we can have a very particular discrimination, a particular person, or we can have a general discrimination, like just whoever's in my way, whoever's on the end of my bullet, or the end of my car, whatever the object is. Okay, so that's the discrimination. Then any of the 3 poisons, like attachment, we can kill out of attachment, or out of hatred or animosity, and then out of confusion or ignorance. We'll come to examples in just a minute. Then the action is taking the life of a living being, or causing or asking someone else to kill for you by a weapon, poison, or other form of violence. So in this text, it includes most cases, not all, but most cases of abortion, euthanasia, and assisted suicide. And then the completion is that being or the beings die before we do. Okay, so let's look at some particular situations. A few came to my mind, so let's look at them, and then we'll see if you have any examples as well. Okay, and before we go there, I think it's important for us to really examine the situation in our own mind. Like, for instance, I'm going to assume that none of us would kill a human being, okay? Let's just assume that's the case. But I think it's helpful to look at, where do we draw the line? Right now in our lives, where do we draw the line? Would you kill a rat in your house if you had one? If there was a rat scurrying in your attic? Would you kill mice if they're in your kitchen? Cockroaches? How about mosquitoes? His Holiness often makes examples of mosquitoes as being pesky. Are you pretty good about refraining from that? What about ticks? In the springtime, we are inundated with ticks just for a period of time. Then it gets too dry and they disappear. They go into hibernation or something. So where do we draw the line? Have we gotten so good that we really don't kill anything? Maybe that's true for some of us. Maybe some of us still have a line that we draw. So it's important to really check up and see, where do we draw the line? And try to encourage ourselves to go a little bit further with our intention to refrain from killing all living beings. Okay. So there's a Muslim festival called the Feast of Sacrifices, Eid al-Adha, if I'm saying that correctly, where they celebrate, it's a worldwide celebration each summer, and it honors the willingness of Abraham to sacrifice his son Ishmael as an act of obedience to God's command. And so before Abraham could sacrifice his son, and there's a version of this in the Christian Bible as well, Allah, or God, provided a lamb to sacrifice instead. And so in commemoration for this intervention, then an animal, usually a sheep, is sacrificed richly. A sheep or bulls, cows, many, many animals can be sacrificed each year. The good news about this is that only 1/3 of the meat is consumed by the family, and the other 2/3 are offered to, distributed to the poor and the needy. So there's some generosity involved. That's the good news. But still, there's this huge act of killing. I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of animals die each year. So what would be the affliction in the mind if that was the case when we consider this animal sacrifice? Attachment? Ignorance, maybe more related to ignorance. What would be an example of attachment, killing out of attachment? Yeah, you can use the microphone.
Want a certain outcome, in this case, with that festival, because it's going to bring you some kind of rewards,
okay.
Right?
Right, so maybe it's a mixed motivation. There's attachment to an outcome, wanting to please God or Allah, but also based on an ignorance of what actually is going to be the outcome of that situation. Thank you. Yeah. Oh.
Going to say attachment to eating the meat, if you enjoy eating the meat.
Yeah, attachment to eat. Hunters, fishermen, women, people who are attached to eating meat. Yeah. Okay. Here's another example. What about the Russian agent who poisoned the Russian opposition leader, Alexei Navalny, with a lethal nerve agent? Did he commit the path of action of killing? Didn't complete it. Thank goodness Alexei did not die. He's recovering in a hospital in Germany right now, recovering his faculty of speech and his bodily movements. Okay, so that's how we can tell. Was that a complete path of action? No, it didn't. We didn't have the branch of completion. But not karma-free, thank you, of course. Even though the complete path of action is not fulfilled, all 4 branches are not fulfilled, still there is karmic repercussion, for sure. Thank you. Good point. Is suicide a path of action? First of all, let me list the 10 states with the highest suicide rates. Montana, Alaska, Wyoming, New Mexico, Idaho, Utah, South Dakota, West Virginia, Arkansas, and Colorado. This is an epidemic. Suicide, feeling helpless, hopeless, despair. This is a mental health epidemic. Is that a complete path of action? No, why not?
Because for completion, the person has to die before you do, and in suicide, that's not possible.
Right, the base is another person, And also that person needs to die before the person committing the action. Okay, so I'm trying to use these examples in the news to give us a sense of how we can use this information to really understand what is that creates these really strong karmic seeds in our mind stream. So watching the news anymore can now be a practice of understanding karma. You know, really investigating, well, were all the 4 branches complete, or were some of them missing? All right, the next non-virtue that we're trying to refrain from is stealing. So the basis for stealing is an object belonging to another person. The attitude is, first of all, correctly identifying the object to be stolen. Any of the 3 poisons, such as attachment to the object, animosity, wishing to destroy the wealth of an enemy, or ignorantly thinking that overcharging a customer or taking things from our employer or cheating the government is okay. And then the desire to take that object, although it has not been freely given, is the motivation. The desire to take the object. The action is taking the object or asking someone else to take the object through force or stealth, being clever about it, or deception. And this would include not paying taxes. Okay, we've got to be really careful here. Not paying taxes, not paying fees or tolls or fares, not paying for movie tickets, slipping in the back door, not returning objects that we borrowed, things like that. And then downloading music that's pirated, downloading videos. What else comes to mind? All right, we'll come back to that. And then the completion for this action is moving the objects or thinking that it is now ours to keep. All right, so a few things that came to my mind. Some say the election was stolen. What do you think? Does that fit all the branches? Are all 4 branches complete?
Basis has to be something viable. I mean, the whole idea about fraud or the votes has not been verified legally, that it's actually the object exists to which you would say would be taken. So, yeah, we're looking at fraud. We're looking at something that was taken away from a certain person, but there's no evidence yet that indeed happened. So the performance of no basis, no performance.
There's no performance? There's no...
There was no intention. I mean, I don't know the intention is being imputed. I'm not sure the intention to steal is even in the picture either. So the motivation's also not verified.
Okay, we've just debunked that the election was stolen. What's that?
We'll see on the 20th.
We'll see on the 6th. We'll see on the 6th and the 20th. Okay. How about the Russian hackers who broke into the U.S. Treasury and Commerce Department and stole information and inserted their own codes into a lot of computer software? Was that stealing? Does that meet the criteria for a path of action of stealing? What do you think? A lot of nodding heads, yes. It's a little tricky here because we don't actually know the intention of the hackers, so we have to be really careful about this and not mind read. But we can infer.
They stole access. Access was not freely given. It was intentionally denied, and they stole it. If they did that. I mean, I didn't read the article.
Yeah, it'd be hard to accidentally break in and hack somebody's large computer system, wouldn't it? It'd probably be pretty intentional. Yeah, okay. Identity theft is on the rise in 2020, even in the pandemic. So we could check that out to see if all the branches are complete. What about looting during the Black Lives Matter protests? Was that stealing? Again, there's some nodding heads. Any dissension? Protests, completely okay, right? Looting, well, it's not a moral judgment. It's just, does it meet the criteria of this universal law of paths of actions? What about using the military to clear a peaceful protest so that a president, for instance, could get a photo op at a church? Is that stealing? Just checking. No? Liberties? He asked, what did he take? I said, liberties. So, okay, so let's examine this. Does it fit the criteria?
I think because he is the commander-in-chief, he's not taking any of the people who was used to clear the group's liberties. They've all signed up to follow his directions, no matter what they really are.
What about the liberty of the peaceful protesters?
Our military is that they are not permitted. I mean, this is one of the general statement about this whole thing, is that they're not legally permitted to interfere and to go against the citizens of which they are meant to protect. Foreign powers, whatever, but for the citizens of one's country, the military is not supposed to get involved, at least our, army and stuff.
And then Venerable Sultram as well.
He can use the military to rise up against powers in the country that are not complying with the foreign or domestic enemies. So at that time, Antifa was labeled as a domestic terror group.
Were Antifa on the lawn?
Antifa and Black Lives Matter at that time were being conflated as the same thing. So he wasn't like out. He had enough legal basis that nobody tried to impeach him about that part.
Venerable Sultram.
Liberties is such a vague word, you can't really specify.
Uh-huh. Okay, thanks for that distinction. So there are a lot of gray areas when it comes to karma. And often when we talk about karma, people start asking 101,000 questions. What about this situation? What about that situation? Some of them are difficult to tease apart, but we can at least go to this basis that we have, or this, this framework, and begin to examine some of these situations that are happening every day.
There may not have been the karma of stealing in that action, but it's also not karma free, because if people were harmed, and they were during that intervention, then the person who ordered that it be done also bears some responsibility and some karma for the harm that was done under that order.
Right, and as Venerable described, harm falls under the path of action of killing, even though it's not a complete path of action of killing. Any physical harm would be categorized or subsumed within killing. Yeah. Okay. Can you think of any other examples of stealing that may have been blatant or obvious in the last year or two or three or four?
I don't know whether it might even be closer to killing. Is a few days ago when that doctor in the Midwest took the 500 vials of vaccine and defrosted them during Christmas. And so they were inviolable. And first he denied it. Second, he said, yes, that's what I did. So they're still investigating it. So it was stealing something that didn't belong to him, but it also is indirectly impacting the people who might have been able to have that vaccine. So, and they're still figuring out the intention, but he did complete the act, and they are no longer usable. So.
Great example. That's theft. Yeah, that's stealing. Taking what's not freely given. Okay. All right, the next one is always an interesting one to bring up with people. It's refraining from the non-virtuous path of action of unwise and unkind sexual misconduct. All right, so let's see what that's all about. So the basis is mainly it's the partner of another person, or someone who does not consent, someone who is celibate, someone who is a close relative, or a child. Primarily, if you are in a relationship, then it means going outside of that relationship, or basically adultery. It could also include having intercourse in or around a temple, blah, blah, blah. Okay, the attitude. Correctly identifying the person with whom you wish to have intercourse. Sometimes in Lamrim text it's translated as persons you wish to sleep with. That's a euphemism, isn't it? Okay, Any of the three poisons can be involved. Attachment, like using others for your own sexual pleasure without caring for their feelings, or angrily raping someone, or ignorantly thinking that sex is a high spiritual practice, that it's chic to have extramarital affairs, or that having protected sex isn't necessary when there's a possibility of sexually transmitted diseases. The action is the meeting of the two organs. Okay? And the completion is that pleasure is experienced. There's one Lamrim text called Liberation in the Palm of Your Hand that says the completion is orgasm. That's incorrect. So it's corrected here in this book. It's just pleasure is experienced with the two organs meeting. Okay, so when I looked at this, names like Harvey Weinstein and Jeffrey Epstein and Bill Cosby and Donald Trump came to mind. There's been a lot of stories in the news about the Catholic Church reconciling with the sexual abuse by priests over decades. But not only the Catholic Church, Protestant ministers, Buddhist lamas, no group is exempt from this, right? So we have to check when we read these stories in the news. Does it fit the criteria of unwise and unkind sexual behavior? Anything come to your mind regarding this non-virtue?
Right, not as spectacular, but who's the North Carolina Democratic Senate candidate who lost to the Republican, Cunningham, and the revelation of his affair that happened before that election. I mean, there's the big spectacular god-awful things, and then there's the sort of private behaviors, not so well known. And I don't know if that tanked his election or not, actually. I don't know how much it affected it, but it was definitely a piece of it.
That I don't think was on that list, but I think kind of falls in both stealing and sexual misconduct is posting other people's pictures. Yeah, that happens constantly. And I think that's both stealing and sexual misconduct.
Good example, thank you.
It came to mind that one of the examples given is not having protected sex. So thinking of people who, especially like the stories we heard about the young people gathering in Florida and different things, and potentially having sex with each other and spreading COVID amongst each other, that carelessness around their sexuality in that sense of spreading a disease that could kill each other.
Yeah. So again, really taking time to examine all of these branches and really looking to see, was there an intention in those actions? There would have been an intention, maybe there was an intention to have sex or to have unkind and unwise sexual behavior, but, was there an intention to harm? No, there was carelessness, for sure, but was there an intention to harm? So that can help us. Not that those actions are karma-free, of course, as we've mentioned, but other...
A little bit tricky to talk about the intention to harm in terms of sexual misconduct, because if your mind is on fire and you want to go have an affair, your intention is not at all to harm. Your intention is to have pleasure and to bring this other person to great bliss or whatever. You're not even having the intention to harm your family because you're not going to tell them, right? So there's something about holding that intent to harm in this one that's not going to work.
Mm-hmm.
Was there an intention to go outside of the agreement? Was there an intention to engage in sexual activity in a way that will be harmful? Yes. But is there an intention to harm? It will take some time and some self-reflection and some regret, I think, to reveal the intent to harm in that case.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, any of these paths of actions can be done out of attachment, hostility.
Yeah, so the intent to harm isn't part of this all. You're just talking about the affliction. So the affliction could be attachment.
Well, anger necessarily has an intention to harm, doesn't it?
Yeah, where's the anger, though?
Well,
we're talking about sexual misconduct, right?
Yes, but you can engage in sexual misconduct with
anger, right? Yes.
Yeah, motivated by anger.
Right, I get that.
So there's an intention to harm.
Right. So what I'm trying to clarify is, I was just trying to understand where the intent to harm comes in. You're talking about what the motivation is. You're talking about, of all these branches there, you're talking about not the motivation, I mean the affliction.
The affliction,
Yeah,
sorry, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
So someone asks, what about euthanizing a pet with the intention to save it from pain? Is that non-virtuous? And also mosquito traps to avoid spreading disease.
Yeah, there are a lot of gray areas, aren't there? We get asked this question a lot, the question about euthanasia in particular, euthanizing pets. And it's maybe not. Yeah, please go ahead.
I think the general rule, I don't know that she heard it from her teacher, I believe, is that if we have some clairvoyance that we know that the euthanizing of that pet will help to bring the alleviation of pain, if we knew in the future we would be able to do that for future rebirth, that this alleviating that pain, if we had the clairvoyance to be able to determine the rebirth as a result of the euthanizing that animal. But because we don't generally have that, by euthanizing a pet, we may actually be interfering in the ripening of a karma that once it's done through the suffering of this life would then present a better opportunity next life. So there's this piece that we don't have enough information to make that determination.
Yeah, it's tricky.
We don't know the rebirth.
Often we think that out of compassion we want to put the animal out of its suffering, but what we need a much larger worldview here, or larger view of continuity of mind, continuity of lives. We don't know where that animal, where the mind stream of that animal may be going. It may be to a better rebirth. It may be to a much more difficult rebirth. And so it might be better to let that animal live out that existence with palliative treatment, of course. Yeah. Not like we're going to make it suffer, but with as compassionate action as we can. So, often we really have to check and see. It's probably a mixture of compassion for the animal, but also there's probably some discomfort for our own inability to bear observing that suffering. And that's hard to tease apart. So we're trying to increase our love and compassion for these animals, and at the same time bring in our understanding of the law of cause and effect in our actions. So this is not an easy thing, and each person will have to weigh this up for themselves, come to their own decision. It's not like there's a black and white answer that goes across the board for every situation. Every person decides for themselves how to deal with this situation. And the other one about mosquitoes and protecting people from disease. What do you think about that? There are many other ways, aren't there? Like using mosquito nets, insect repellents, things like that. They're a little more cumbersome, aren't they? They take a little more effort. When I lived in Australia, we called them white ants. They're termites. Termites were a huge problem in the bush. And, it was so easy for people just to call the exterminator and bring them in to save a house or save a structure. And one of our nuns' huts was infested. And we were wrestling with, what do we do? And one of the nuns put her foot down and said, no way are we going to kill these termites. There's got to be a better way. And she went and researched it and found a humane way to deal with the termites. So if we're creative, if we have ingenuity, we can find ways to get around some of these ethical dilemmas. Yeah.
Another question. Could you please comment on whether freeing a being who is unjustly confined would be stealing?
Freeing a being who is unjustly confined, how would that be stealing?
Or like a prisoner?
Oh, I thought they were talking about humans, not sheep or animals.
Stealing from the public, whoever imprisoned them. They're sort of, they belong to the state or to the people or whatever.
Okay, so I'm going to ask this person to think about these 4 branches and come back to us with what you think is your best answer, okay? So look at the basis, the attitude, make your best guess about the attitude, and the performance and the completion. This is how we're being trained to be intelligent Buddhists, or people intelligent with regard to our own actions. And so, we could spend weeks here. What about this situation? What about that situation? But the point I'm trying to bring across is, how do we apply this? And here's a good example. So please take a moment to go through that. Someone else had their hand up. Yeah.
Example of the mosquitoes made me think of the mass killing of minks in Denmark, I think, in the last year, where it's a public health concern. All these minks are infected with coronavirus. So from the side of the state, they are mandating that these farmers exterminate all the mink they have. None of these farmers want to kill the mink, right? But they have to, by law. It was so painful, and I think the public health officer who had to pass this was weeping too. It was awful, just looking at the pictures. Well, from a Buddhist point of view, we wouldn't have a mink industry to begin with, because it's all used for fur coats.
Yeah. Yeah, the same with killing of poultry with bird flu and pigs with swine flu.
Yeah, the minks is a complicated one because, they're going to kill those minks. I mean, that's what they're raising them for, too. Mm-hmm. And it's not just Denmark. That's what the article was about. It's Netherlands, Italy, Utah, Wisconsin. About 9 times as many minks have been killed as humans that have died from coronavirus. About 17 million.
17 million. Worldwide. Yeah. Okay, let's move on to the next one. The next path of action is to refrain from the path of action of lying. So it's really helpful to think about, when do you think it's okay to lie? It's become quite commonplace. When do you personally think it's okay to lie? Where do you draw the line? To cover your derriere, to save a life. How many of us have the opportunity to lie to save a life? That's the example that often comes in at the Lam Rim. But in our own lives, we really have to examine where these little white lies are popping up, and we just see them as normal, as part of business. What if you're asked to lie in your for your job, for instance? Do you stay in that job? So, the obvious example, President Trump has told over 20,000 lies that were documented by the Washington Post newspaper. This year? No, I think it's all 4 years. Okay, maybe it's this year. Somebody check. Seems utterly unable to take responsibility for mistakes. So the lies like, we have the virus under control, the virus will just disappear on its own, we're doing the greatest job of any country to control the virus, etc. Okay, so that's a pretty good example. Just this year. In the last 14 months, there have been over 20,000 lies. Documented lies. Verified. Verified and documented. Okay. Now, again, we don't, so let's read about lying. What's the basis? So the basis is what is seen, heard, distinguished, or cognized, and what is not seen, not heard, not distinguished, or not cognized. The person lied to is a human being other than oneself. You can't lie to your cat. A human being other than yourself who is capable of understanding the attitude. Okay, so first of all, is misrepresenting what has been seen, heard, or distinguished, or cognized, or their opposites. So that's the cognition. Any of the 3 poisons. You can lie with attachment, try to gain something from a person, or protecting our own reputation. Angrily lying to deceive. Ignorantly thinking there is nothing wrong with lying. And then the desire is to make the other person believe what is false. The action is speaking, writing, gesturing, tweeting. It doesn't say that, but we could include it. Tweeting what we know to be untrue for personal gain, knowingly misleading others, etc. Okay, and then the completion is the other person understands what we have said. Doesn't mean they believe it. They don't have to believe it for it to be a lie. It just means that they've heard it and understood it. If the other person doesn't understand it, it's just idle talk. And all four of these verbal faults that we're going through now, these verbal actions, are passive actions, whether we do them ourselves or we have someone else do them for us. Has anyone ever asked you to answer the phone and lie to somebody? That's so uncomfortable. Yeah. Okay. So, again, we have to be careful about imputing a motivation to a person who's lying. We don't necessarily know that, but we can guess cautiously. We can infer. What are some of the big lies that stand out for you from 2019 or 2018?
COVID thing is going to go away when it warms up.
Or when it gets cold. So you're wondering if there was an intention to deceive.
Sometimes you say things out of wishful thinking without, you know, I mean, it has impact, but it, you know, that's a case where we're really looking to understand the intention is important there.
Maybe it was just positive thinking out loud.
Yeah.
Not lying.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I remember that a few things were said about how doing vote by mail would allow for so much fraud, and there's no way we can possibly vote by mail, you know, as a whole country. I know those of you who've been living in Washington for a while find this utterly surprising, but that was one where it's harder to see that as positive wishful thinking.
Uh-huh. Okay. Good example. So you see how watching the news can become a complete Dharma activity with the right motivation, the right intention. Okay, so again, checking up to see for ourselves, where are we actually telling little white lies? Where are we telling big lies? Yeah, Matt?
I want some clarity on what the right intention is. You said you could watch the Dharma, you can make watching news a Dharma activity by doing this, but a lot of this is kind of just judging what other people are doing. Is that the right intention for doing Dharma contemplation while watching the news, or are you speaking to something different?
Is there a difference between judging and observing what's going on? And staying informed? Trying to stay informed?
So the intention is just to stay informed and observe karma in other people?
Well, the way I have heard Venerable speak about it is that we can use everything about our lives as a Dharma activity. And to be socially engaged, we can't just isolate ourselves, especially as monastics. We can't just isolate ourselves up here in the Abbey and not understand what's going on around us. How would we help people not understanding what's happening politically or socially? So, you know, we have a small window each day or each week where we can look at the news, and some of us stretch that a little more than others, but, you know, we need to stay informed.
It's very important when we're talking about karma to have to come back again and again and again, that what we're looking for is examples to reflect on our own life and experience. We're not watching the news to judge. We're not watching the news to have a critical mind, but we're watching the news to try to understand what the Buddha taught, and to see the expression, the manifestation of the Four Noble Truths, or you know, right in front of us, and to look at the news and understand the nature of cyclic existence and self. So it's informing our own minds. It also informs our decisions. You know, if we are aware of what lies are and we see them in certain people where we have the opportunity to vote, then we can make an informed decision about how much we want to participate in that. But the bigger point is not to, you know, it's not to be watching in order to criticize and rant at the world. It's in order to understand the Dharma and our own minds.
Yeah, and actually the main point is to refrain ourselves from these 10 non-virtues. I just thought it might be engaging, a little more engaging, to talk about what we've observed in the world, what we've seen.
I think taking the Dhamma perspective and looking at it through the lens of karma as well might help, at least in my mind, it helps me work with the afflictions that arise. As opposed to getting angry for that person who's done X, Y, Z, I can say, looking at through the Dhamma lens puts a bit more distance there and makes it easier for me to tap into the compassion of, wow, look at the causes of suffering that they might be creating for themselves in the future if this is how I'm seeing it in this way.
Yeah, that's a great point. I know for myself, the more I look at the afflictions and understand them in my own mind, the more compassion I have for others. I have a long way to go, but that certainly seems to be the case. So, good point. Thank you.
Just to parrot what Venerable said in the past too, when we look at these stories and we think, or we're horrified and we're just thinking, how could someone do that? Well, in fact, we probably have done that in the past. And to really look at the causes and conditions that came up for that person, you know, why would they behave in that way? Well, you start learning about their childhood, you know, different experiences they've had. So it brings compassion, but it also brings some depth to our own purification practice. Like, I haven't done those things in this life, maybe, but the potential to do them is there still.
The fifth path of action is the fifth non-virtuous path of action is called divisive speech. So let's have a look at that. The basis is people who are friendly or who are disharmonious. That's a basis. The attitude, first of all, correctly identifying the people to be separated, either separated initially or to be made further separated. Yep. Any of the three poisons, attachment, like wanting a couple to split up so that you can be with one of the members, or criticizing competitors so that you will get the promotion or close a deal, or hatred or jealousy, wanting to split up, wanting to stir up trouble. Oh, I see, wanting to stir up trouble with divisive speech, or ignorantly causing disunity among those of another religion in order to convert them. And then the motivation is the desire to separate or cause friction between others. So the action is causing disunity among friends or preventing those who are not harmonious from reconciling. Doesn't matter whether what we say is true or not. And then the completion is that the other person understands what you have said. If they don't, it's idle speech. Okay, so when is it that we have used divisive speech in our own lives? Sometimes it may not even be on our radar. You know, just to say to a friend something about a third person, you know, so-and-so, he's like this or she's like that. That creates a doubt in our friend's mind about the character or the actions of that person. Is that divisive speech? It does. It could create a separation, couldn't it? We want that person to side with us, so it could create a separation. So those little things can happen so insidiously. Probably none of us are going to go out and, you know, really kill somebody or steal something big or hopefully not engage in unwise and unkind sexual behavior. But these four verbal non-virtues are so easy to engage in. And there's a whole continuum of severity. And so these are the ones we really have to pay attention to, as well as, we have to pay attention to all of them, of course. But for myself, I find these are the ones where I get into trouble. Also the three mental ones. So just really looking to see, when is it that under what conditions do we use divisive speech? It's important to investigate that so that we can watch out for it. Under what conditions and in what situations are we likely to engage in that, so we can have a strong intention to avoid it. So 2020 was filled with divisive speech. Where do we start? Anybody have a good example in mind? Or maybe from your own experience, maybe that's safer, but go ahead.
What came to mind was the political primaries, in that people would speak badly about their opponents in the primary, but then later support that person when they've bowed out of the primary race and be surprised that their supporters don't want to vote for that person.
Just from this year, but any of the disinformation campaigns that a government does to another country is divisive speech, and they do it to do that, to divide the people, so that then it benefits whatever their agenda is. It's happened for decades. And specifically, you know, like we did this in Iran many years ago, and to destabilize the country. That's probably what's happening in our country now, and in Europe it's documented to be happening in these countries. So I think that's divisive speech.
I think some of the language that has been used against immigrants and refugees coming into our country that are told to be a threat to our livelihood, stealing jobs that are deserving for people who are residents of our country, that they're going to be working more cheaply, they'll take the livelihoods away, and that really does bring a fear in a number of the communities in our country, thinking that they're losing their jobs specifically from the people who are coming in here with refugee or immigrant status. So there's this, misinformation about what exactly the benefits or disadvantages of having immigrants come into a country. That is, on this part, is causing disharmony, where they might be able to see that there can be an asset to this country, instead causing a distrust between people that don't even almost know each other. You know,
Thanks, that's a
but
great
want to be
example.
together, want to help.
What about some of the rhetoric about white supremacy that's been rampant on social media, as well as other mediums?
Confused if this one has all four, but just generally countries always being at each other's throat and saying things that are unhelpful for diplomatic purposes. It's not like harsh in nature, but it's definitely, the intention is not to cooperate. Like the intention is to sow further uncooperation.
To create enemies, really, isn't it? Yeah. Okay, so what branch would be missing? There's a basis.
I suppose the intention is just totally unknown. You know, I'm thinking mostly like this quote-unquote trade war with China. It's like, we could definitely just cooperate and it would be fine. But it's not what the leader wants to do.
Okay. Yeah.
Someone online says the China virus, calling the coronavirus the China virus.
Perfect example of divisive speech.
There's a question about the opposite of each non-virtuous action.
Yeah.
Could you mention them eventually?
You know, it's a tall order to cover both these sets in just an hour and, what time do we stop? 5:30. Hour and a half. But just generally speaking, so the opposite of the virtuous path of action of, let's see, how do you say that? So there's the non-virtuous path of action of killing. There's the virtuous path of action of avoiding killing or even protecting life. So protecting life, like I was mentioning, taking insects that we find in our home outside, you know, getting a container, taking them outside when it's not freezing, or putting them in the garage during the winter, things like that. Buying animals that are bound for slaughter, if that's a possibility, taking them to an animal sanctuary, doing animal liberation. So those all fall within the virtuous action of protecting life. Instead of the path of action of negative path of action of stealing, there's the positive path of action of protecting other people's property, their material property or intellectual property. We could probably add as well. Unkind and unwise sexual behavior. The opposite of that is the path of action, the intention to protect the integrity of other people's relationships, our own relationships and other people's relationships, being faithful. Lying, to refrain from the negative path of action of lying. Then the opposite of that would be the virtuous path of action of telling the truth, keeping in mind that the motivation for doing that would have to be a virtuous state of mind. We wouldn't tell the truth to harm somebody. Instead of divisive speech, we would have speech that would unify people, bring people together. What a concept. We haven't gotten to harsh speech yet. Okay, so like that. And again, these are all spelled out in any Lam Rim text, or Lam Rim is a Tibetan word that means the graduated path to enlightenment. One of the beautiful contributions of the Tibetan culture, the Tibetan Buddhist culture, is to take all the Buddhist teachings and put them in a very systematic way of study. The Buddha gave 84,000 teachings, they say, and to try to study all of these teachings would be formidable. But luckily, some of the early scholars like Lama Atisha put these teachings in a very systematic way of being able to study them in a progressive order, a progressive fashion, giving us an outline of what it takes for an ordinary mind to move all the way to full awakening. So you'll find these description of these in books, wonderful books like The Foundation of Buddhist Practice. Yeah. Okay. So the next one is harsh speech. We didn't do that one, right? Harsh speech. The basis is a sentient being who will be hurt by your words, which means anyone other than maybe some Ari beings, anyone other than a Buddha, but maybe some highly realized beings as well. The attitude is correctly identifying the person you want to hurt with your harsh words. And any of the three poisons can be involved. Attachment, like criticizing others in order to be accepted by a group of people, going along with the gang. Angrily denigrating the enemy so that others will side with us. Or speaking angrily, harshly to rouse the troops to fight. Ignorantly thinking that we are clever or witty, using harsh words. How many of us have a very cynical type of humor that really amounts to harsh speech? We have to take a look at that. And then the desire is to speak harshly and make someone feel bad. The action is criticizing, insulting, ridiculing, maliciously teasing, verbally abusing, angrily blaming, humiliating someone privately or in front of others, etc. So that's quite a large category of actions. What do you think? Tweeting fit in there? Yeah, it would, wouldn't it? Tweeting, posting. And then the completion is the other person understands what was said, like the others. So again, 2020 was also filled with harsh speech, wasn't it? I hope we haven't become callous to it so that we accept it as the new normal. And hopefully we can come back to a more civil discourse. We'll see. All right, any examples stick out in your mind? And these categories may not be mutually exclusive. In other words, some examples that we might bring up could fit in several categories.
The presidential debates.
Harsh words flew in the presidential debates, didn't they? Yeah.
The president referring to the leader of North Korea as Rocket Man when he wasn't at first cooperating.
You don't have to raise your hands, but how many of us will be purifying our own harsh speech from 2020, from the political landscape and etc. The handling of certain situations like the pandemic or the racial discord. Yeah. Okay, harsh words. Okay, then the last one of the verbal non-virtues is called idle talk. So the basis is a topic. Now, it's not a person, it's a topic without real meaning or importance. What does that mean? Doesn't that sound kind of relative or subjective? The attitude is knowing the topic we wish to speak about. It can be done with any of the three poisons, like with attachment, flattering or hinting to get something that we want, angrily wanting to disturb someone, ignorantly wanting to pass the time. Just, chatting without any real purpose. And then the motivation is the desire to speak in this way. So the action, again, is quite extensive. Gossiping, telling stories, joking without a good purpose, praying for terrible things to happen to others, wailing, complaining, teaching the Dharma to someone lacking interest or respect, reciting liturgies of other religions for no good reason, repeating jingles and slogans, grumbling, bickering over meaningless things, talking about entertainment, sports, politics, crime, and so forth without a good reason. Oh, phew. And then the completion. I always have a good reason, don't you? Okay, better check up. Oh, I don't want to lie, so I better check up. Completion, then saying the words out loud. It's not necessary that anyone hears or understands. So we can talk to ourselves. We can have idle speech with ourselves. In some books, I know they include singing for no purpose. So that wouldn't be chanting. So this doesn't mean that every time we open our mouths, we have to talk about deep and meaningful things, right? It depends on the motivation. So often the example is given that in a work situation where we need to get along with people, we need to create relationships, establish relationships with coworkers, then we're going to chit-chat about things that others are interested in so that we can make that connection. But where it gets into trouble, where we get into trouble, is when we do it for no good reason, or maybe one of these non-virtuous reasons, motivations. Again, I think we could say that 2020 was filled with a lot of idle talk. More than usual, do you think? No? You don't think it's more than usual? It's just amplified this year, maybe, this past year.
When we're connecting with others, there's a consideration of content and duration. Yeah, to know when it's enough to connect and when we're just going in idle talk. It's interesting, though, that if it's somebody that isn't interested in Buddhism, we need to chit-chat with them if we want to connect. Because if we start talking to them about the Dharma and they're not interested, that's idle talk.
Right. Another example that comes to mind is that we have a rule here at the Abbey that we don't talk about food at a meal for more than 5 minutes, because we can go on for a long time talking about food, what we like, what we don't like, what we're going to make next time, how we do it differently, etc. So we need parameters to help rein ourselves in. Yeah.
Did it mention in there also if you talk to like an animal or somebody who can't understand you?
Well, the basis is a topic. Yeah, this is like a nice summary of many different, I think it's a summation of many different presentations of this. So there will be different aspects, different presentations in various Lamrim texts.
I think we're protected from a lot of idle talk that happens through technology just because we don't have social media accounts, right? So much of that is just, it seems to me, is a lot of meaningless chatter on Twitter and all that. It made me wonder about why people produce spam that I never get. But you get a lot of spam, right, from robots or whatever. Why would you do that? Most of it's total rubbish.
So the person who creates spam, that would be idle talk?
I guess so. I don't know. I'm not being harmed, but yeah, it's just weird to me that people make robots that produce spam, right? That spam your email addresses. Why? I don't know.
You have to look at the intention. Yeah. Okay, we just have a few minutes left, so let's just quickly mention the 3 mental non-virtues. These paths of actions. So all 10 of these non-virtues that we're talking about are paths of actions. The first 7 are actions. They're actions of body and speech. The last 3 are not actions. They're considered afflictions. The 2 are mutually exclusive. That finally, the penny dropped for me. I thought I would share. Okay. So covetousness is the next one. And as we know, things all originate in the mind. So these are, for a long time I thought, oh, I don't need to worry about these because there's so many conditions that are necessary to have valid or a full path of action of covetousness or ill will or wrong views, that I don't need to worry about them. But when I started looking into them, I thought, no, all of these conditions come together quite quickly, quite easily. So let's look at covetousness. The basis is the possessions or wealth of another person. The attitude is correctly identifying the object. Any of the 3 poisons, actually that's true of all 10 non-virtues. They can be done with any of the 3 poisons. And then the desire is to make that object your own. So it's a mental state of mind. It's a mental affliction. It's a series of conceptions. The action is thinking, I will obtain this, I will make this mine, and then planning how to obtain it. The completion is the determination to obtain the object. So you've thought about making this thing, this object, yours over and over and over again until you get to the point where you are certain that you're going to make it yours. That's the completion. So it's a little more tricky to identify when that's actually happening in the mind. The completion. Okay, so to be complete, 5 factors are necessary. Maybe that's more detail than we need, but I'll just read through them quickly. Being very attached to your possessions already, wanting to accumulate more, longing to examine and experience the possessions of others, thinking that what another person has should be yours, and lacking any integrity or shame and not wanting to be free from the faults of covetousness. So those 5 conditions can all come together quite easily. So you can see how we're really needing to be mindful. We need to have mindfulness of what's happening in our mind and a lot of introspective alertness to be checking to see if we're being mindful, to be watching our mind all the time. Okay, so from the example that Venerable used this morning about how we just apply this label of president, could there be coveting of the title president? It's not a material thing, but could there be coveting of that? I'm curious. I'm not sure. I couldn't come to a conclusion. It seems to make it sound like it's a material possession. So that's something we can continue investigating. I'll bet there was some coveting of successful vaccine formulas of another company or country. What do you think? That's a material thing. Well, a patent, maybe a patent for a vaccine. Maybe there's some coveting of electoral college votes going on. But are electoral college votes wealth or property of somebody? See, these are the gray areas that it's hard to really pin down some of these things. So it's worthwhile to take some time to really examine, where have I been covetous? What have I been coveting in the last year in this pandemic while I've been semi-isolated or fully isolated? Really examining that affliction in our own mind. Same thing with ill will and wrong views. We've run out of time, so we'll have to save those for another time. It was a tall order to try to go through these. And luckily, Venerable's beautiful teachings, these are preserved on the tubtenchodron.org website. So please have a look at those when you have time and go through them all. And if you don't have this volume already, it's such a great resource to have on your shelf. Okay, so let's rejoice that we had this opportunity to either hear about most of these 10 non-virtuous path of actions for the first time, or perhaps we're hearing them again and we've had a chance to review them a little bit and think about applying them in terms of how we listen to the news. Of course, we're applying them to ourselves, but also, using them to help us evaluate different situations different situations. So by rejoicing before we dedicate, we actually increase the virtue that we're going to dedicate.